Welcome everybody to tonight's event organized by Correlated Netherlands. Correlated Netherlands is an organization that connects data scientists with organizations that advance the social good. So we have about 300 data scientists in our Dutch network and over 1,000 abroad. And we're very delighted today to have Johan Frijns as a speaker. Johan is a co-founder and director of BankTrack, an organization whose mission it is to stop banks from financing harmful business activities such as deforestation and the expansion of fossil fuel infrastructure. BankTrack also promotes a banking sector that respects human rights and helps other civil society organizations engage with the banking sector. And they continue to put out key reports and engaging campaigns, which I'm sure Johan will talk about tonight. As for the agenda, Johan will give a talk, 30-40 minutes. We have a discussion. And then if you haven't done so yet, and if you're excited about it, we'll switch to sustainable bank. So if you're keen on that, stay on after the talk and the Q&A to do that as a group. So without further ado, Johan, please take it away.
Thank you. Thank you very much for the opportunity to speak tonight. I'm calling in from home, as most people do. I find myself in quarantine since my son got tested positive yesterday. Otherwise, I would have gone to the office for this. But so I'm in my attic, which also explains the bit dark light here. I'm sorry about that. I thought we are 2.5 weeks after the Glasgow summit, although it feels already like months ago. I mean, things happen so fast in the world these days that Glasgow seems like a far away, long ago event. But I thought it would be interesting to reflect a bit on the importance of the Glasgow Climate Summit, especially for the work that we do for the banking sector, and also the relations between what happened there and what should happen in the banking sector. Let me switch my screen or share my screen, and then I'll go on. This is always the tricky part, even after so many times. I assume you see my screen. Can someone confirm? Then
yeah, perfect.
Yep, we're definitely seeing it.
Yes, we can.
Yes, okay. All right. As I said, I wanted to talk a bit about tracking and ditching fossil banks. That was the title of the talk after Glasgow, after what happened 2.5 weeks ago in Scotland. I thought let me outline. There was 25 slides, but it will be within the 45 minutes. I thought, let me first speak a bit about BankTrack, what we do, why we exist, talk a bit about the climate crisis and how to define it, Glasgow outcomes, as I mentioned, what happened there and how relevant it is it for the banking sector. Then talk about what we always refer to as fossil banks, the banks that finance the fossil fuel industry. And the no thanks refers to the campaigning that we do. So then you know where we are when I proceed. First about BankTrack. We are a civil society watchdog, as was already mentioned, focused on the commercial banks. Sorry, we exist since 2003, but it was then founded as a network of organizations. At the end, there was 40 organizations globally that together under the name of BankTrack were monitoring the banking sector. That's no longer the case. In 2015, we changed for all kinds of reasons to an organization based in Nijmegen in the Netherlands. I never miss an opportunity to put a picture of Nijmegen in a presentation, so there it is. And since then, we are a standalone organization. But we work with all these organizations globally, still with the same mission, namely to monitor bank activities, policy developments, and investment decisions of banks. And we do this with 10 people, 12 if you include our volunteers at the moment. One of them is here, Eric, and that's us. It's of course a ridiculous ambition to monitor with 10 people the global banking sector. There is nobody seems to know quite how many banks exist, but sometime between 15 and 20,000 is what usually is mentioned. We don't have a limit. We don't have a geographical limit. We look at banks from Brazil to Japan and everything in between. But practically speaking, there is about, well, Eric should know better than me, but I think there is about 150 active profiles of banks on our website. And we monitor a lot of banks. And of course, there is some banks that get more attention from us than others, and we'll come to that in a minute. But our focus is on commercial banks, which means we don't work on, let's say, the World Bank or the European Investment Bank or export credit agencies and all that. It's the banks that you know, or at least some that you will know for sure. And recently we reframed the way we work, what we do, and we now present ourselves as, we are an organization that challenges banks to act now, which expresses our impatience and the urgency of all these matters on 4 interconnected global emergencies. And that is 3 of them is work that we have already been doing for a long time. And the 4th is what we hope to pick up in 2022. And that is stopping catastrophic climate change. It's kind of sad that we cannot just say stopping climate change, because in all honesty, that's too late. We're not going to stop climate change, but we still aim for stopping the catastrophic version of it. We try to, we challenge banks to act on stopping the destruction of nature in a very wide range of things. That is about deforestation. It's about, impact of plastics. It's about everything that has an impact on, on nature. And of course, we focus on those business sectors that impact on forest, for example, soy, beef, palm oil, that kind of things, and deforestation itself, like logging itself, of course. Our 3rd focus is on widespread human rights violations the world over, caused by companies financed by banks. And we see it as a role to hold banks accountable for the finance that they provide to companies that then either cause or are linked to human rights violations. And the 4th focus, which we will not surprise you where it comes from, is we thought hard about whether we can make banks co-responsible for preventing the emergence of an era of pandemics. This would take a whole talk in itself, but pandemics don't come out of nowhere. I mean, everything that you see on this screen, continued destruction of nature, climate change, will all lead to further spread of zoonosis and all kinds of trouble. And we think that if banks would be more aware of what they finance and what they should not finance, this may contribute a bit to avoiding that very dramatic situation, which I think we all hate. I do, at least. It would go very far to explain how we do this, but usually we present our work along these lines. We track banks. We have, as I said, about 150 live profiles on our website. We have a lot that is on record and things, but we track their policies. We track investment decisions, we track their involvement in what we call dodgy deals. These are whatever companies or projects with a large negative impact on the planet. We track business initiatives of banks, such as the Equator Principles, the Principles for Responsible Banking. I'll come to that. Okay, so there's a lot of tracking. There's a lot of, keeping an eye on what's happening with all these banks. And as I said, there is a great many banks to follow. We don't claim to have all that up to date, but we try very hard. And I think our website is a very reliable source of information for campaigners on the status of banks. We engage. We are definitely a campaigning organization. We try to change things. We study the banks to change them, but that does not preclude that we also engage quite intensively with banks. We have a lot of conversations with banks, either one-to-one or as part of coalitions. We get asked to comment on banks' policies, draft policies. We get invited to webinars, etc. Which is all to say that it's not impossible to be both a campaigning organization that is also at the same time, I think, respected and invited by banks. And we, of course, if you want to change a bank, you need to have their ear. So that's the balancing act that we are always doing day by day. And finally, we support a lot of organizations that also want to engage with banks for one reason or the other, but they may lack the expertise or the contacts or the the ideas on how exactly to do that, how to influence banks so that they start acting in the way that these groups want. And that can be all kinds of things. Literally all, like, to stop the expansion of the airport of Bogota, financed by HSBC, to animal testing, financed by other banks. There's all kinds of topics that come to us. Of course, our capacity is limited, but we try to support other organizations. That, I think, in a nutshell, is what we do for the last 18 years. And as I said, one of the things that we focus on already from the very beginning in 2003 is the role of banks in financing the climate crisis. And there's a great many ways of talking about the climate situation. And I thought this sums it up for the purpose of this conversation that we have. I'm sure you have seen this this picture on the top left. I mean, I can't think of a better way of presenting where we are up to than this that was founded by, I forgot his name. I should give due credit to the person that came up with it from Reading University. But what it shows is, yes, exactly, yes. I'll put that next time next to the slide. But it shows, as you probably know, the movement in temperature since 1815. The blue lines are the years that were below the average, and the more red it gets is above average. And of course, that's where we are. We are in a quite dramatic situation that gives very little time to turn around, or to at least to stop it from getting even worse. That's where we are. And since 1992, we tried to do something about this. I mean, the problem was known much before that, but since 1992, starting with the United Nations Framework, UNFCCC, United Nations Framework on Climate Change, that was adopted in 1992 in Rio de Janeiro. And already then, it was known that the reason why we are in this situation is the burning of fossil fuels, the burning of greenhouse gases. And I found this, actually, the link was provided by Fabian in the things. Let's say over half or maybe 2/3 of the problem is caused by the burning of coal, oil, and gas. To put it in another way, if you may have seen that picture on the top, sorry, on the lower left, which is a depiction of what is mentioned as the carbon budget. What is allowed to still burn if we want to remain within the either 2-degree or 1.5-degree target of the Paris Climate Agreement. And as you can see, if you look on the left, that column shows what would be the emissions if we would burn all the already developed coal, oil, and gas reserves in the world. And as you can see, if we do that, if we continue burning even the reserves that are already in production, then we will go way beyond the 1.5 target, but we will also go beyond the 2-degree target, which is widely considered and dismissed now as a target that we absolutely should not aim for. We should aim for a 1.5-degree target to have and that's also important to mention, a 50% chance. It's not even sure. It's just that we have, like, it's crazy the risk that we take with the planet, but that's what we are. So it's totally clear that even burning the developed oil, coal, and gas reserves will get us into deep trouble, let alone if we would also start to burn the reserves that are held by countries, by oil companies, by fossil fuel companies. And there is some figures on the right that I did not learn by heart, but it's clear that the root cause of the climate crisis is the burning of coal, oil, and gas. Or to put it in another way, if we want to have a fighting chance of stopping the climate crisis, we must end the fossil fuel industry pronto, soon. We have almost no time left. So if that is the way to look at it, then you would expect that since 1992, we have been looking at the coal, oil, and gas industry because that is evident. It's the root cause of the problem. Not so. I think it's one of the tragedies of the world that from the very beginning in 1992, the problem was framed as how to curb emissions. So actually you start at the wrong side of the problem. You start with the fact that there is, chimneys where the CO2 is coming out of the chimney. But what we should have been looking at, and that's deliberately failed. I mean, it's actively sabotaged by the oil and the fossil fuel industry. What we should have been looking at for the last 26 years, or well, even 30 years by now, is the production side. None of that has happened. And I think since then we are in a pretty tragic trajectory of endless discussions between countries about how to curb emissions, which is, emissions by definition come from millions of sources, whereas the production would have been difficult to stop, but it's manageable. We would talk about a few hundred places, maybe a few thousand places in the world where we should have taken action. And the entire discussions globally on how to deal with the climate crisis would have been completely different than they were. But of course, there is nothing we can do about it. We are here. I mentioned these things here to illustrate a bit how the discussion then went and where let's say, the hopeful signs are. And of course, this is too short a conversation to cover the entire negotiations, but the Paris Agreement was, of 2015 was, of course, despite it not focusing on coal, oil and gas, a watershed moment. For the first time, that 1.5 degree target was mentioned, although as you can see the way it was formulated, it was pursue efforts to limit the temperature increase to 1.5 degrees. And those familiar with how these negotiations are, let me assure you that that half sentence took 500 people, 20 nights to discuss and to negotiate, but it's there. It's 1.5 degrees is what we aim for. But it was there as, yeah, come on, it's not we aim for 2, but we may aim for 1.5. That was nevertheless important. We have a figure. In 2018, the IPCC report, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, that is the scientific basis of the climate negotiations, became more practical. It said, like, if we want to stay below 1.5 degrees, which is what we should, there's a lot of reasons in the report why we should, we need to hurry. We need to halve all emissions by 2030, which was 12 years away in 2018, and come to effectively zero, net zero, as we call it these days, by 2050. So suddenly there was like a timeline, and a very frightening timeline, about how little time we have left to come to this. And I hate to break it, but while in 2018 we concluded that emissions should be halved in 2030, 3 years have passed and emissions have only gone up. There has not been any such change since 2018 or even now. Just this year, the 6th progress report of IPCC pressed this point. It mentions it's all very well to aim for 2030 and 2050, but we need immediate, rapid and large-scale reductions. And the emphasis on immediate puts the expansion, the ongoing expansion of the fossil fuel industry into the spotlight. So I think it's also very important that those words are part of the conversation nowadays. And I mean, no one that understands the situation can call the Glasgow outcomes a success, not even anyone in the room. But I think the one key sentence that we will take away from the Glasgow summit that is mentioned in the Glasgow, I forgot the exact name of the document that comes out of it, is this sentence that half a sentence about accelerating efforts towards the phase down of unabated coal power and phase out of inefficient fossil fuel subsidies. For the first time, there is mentioning of fossil fuels in the context of subsidies, and there is coal. There is no oil and gas there, and that is that's of course again deliberate. No, it's quite easy to. I mean, it's basically a no-brainer these days that we should stop the burning of coal. Like even we'll come to that in a minute. But it was too much to get to phase out. Those who followed the conversation in Glasgow know that the initial effort was aimed to get the sentence accelerating efforts towards the phase out of unabated coal power. That didn't make it, but it's there. And in the same way as movements such as us have captured the 1.5 degree of the 2015 Paris Agreement, we will take this and we will say, like, you have recognized, you have acknowledged that what we need is an end to the coal industry, and per definition that means that you also need to look at oil and gas. I'm going into a bit of detail of this because I think this frames the discussion as we have it now. Thankfully, there is others that have more sense, and they come from a very unexpected corner, which is the International Energy Agency. This is the very body that was founded by Western countries to ensure the secure supply of coal, oil, and gas for a long time in its history. But it has turned into something quite amazing thanks to its director, Bito. And it has become increasingly vocal about the need to look at and to the role of coal, oil, and gas. And it's in May 2021, it came with this net zero by 2050 roadmap, where this is our gift from the gods. It is the text coming from a source that it's not from Greenpeace, it's from the International Energy Agency that says these things about oil, gas, and coal. Crystal clear. There is no chance that we can continue with if we want to reach that 1.5 degree target. That's what I should emphasize. Then this is what's necessary: an end to oil, an end to new gas fields, an end to building natural gas LNG facilities, no new coal mines, and all rapidly. And as if this was not enough, a few months later, the same International Energy Agency came out with the World Energy Outlook. This is the report that comes out every year, and I think it's the most authoritative report on the state of the world's energy sector and the trends. And it's, I mean, the language there is even better than before. It's as of this year that we have to stop the approval of all new oil and gas fields, coal mines, or mine extensions. Again, it's not Greenpeace, it's the International Energy Agency making that point towards governments. Act now, because we are going to be in deep trouble if you don't. We're never going to make the 1.5 degree target. And I don't know if this works, but this is the director. And if I click on it, it's supposed to, you hear him speak in response to, you may have heard of the Cambo oil fields, a new oil development of the, what is it, the Shetland Islands, I believe, and the UK government has to approve it, which is a tricky thing if you're also the host of the Glasgow Climate Summit. And Fatih speaks about this, but I'm not sure if this is actually working. I hope it is. Oops, this was too good to be true, of course. Can you hear this?
We can hear, but no video.
It's also very quiet.
It doesn't work, no?
I think we're hearing it through your speakers through your microphone.
Yeah, probably.
Yeah, the sound is very low. Maybe you could give a summary of what it was about.
1 second. This was, of course, too good to be true. I thought I would be able to. Let me get back to the. Oops, sorry. Are you still there? Yes, you are.
We're still here.
Yeah, okay. Yeah. That didn't work. I thought I could click from my PowerPoint to Twitter, but that doesn't work, and it's beyond my technological understanding of these things. But here is the director of the International Energy Agency talking to the UK government, saying, if you are serious about meeting the 1.5 degrees target, of the Paris. There can be no new exploration, no new oil fields, no new gas fields, no new coal fields. This is where we are. This is this is nothing new for people that have worked on this, you know, in the climate movement for the last 30 years. I'm one of them, so I can't help it. But it's amazing that that it is now becoming the communist opinion of the we have to stop burning coal, oil, and gas. There is differences about when and where, but it's moving in that direction. And some governments also get it. And coming back to Glasgow, this is what I think is major outcomes, not so much of the negotiation process itself, but you know, in the area, you know, and what happens also during Glasgow, or during climate COPs in general. There is the Beyond Oil and Gas Alliance, which I think is, if you go to their website, it's 12 governments that are committing to end new concessions, licensing, or leasing rounds and set a Paris line date for ending oil and gas production. This is not about coal, which is now not such a big deal anymore, but this is about why is this moving? This is about this is governments coming to that conclusion. There is also, you may have heard, that 40 countries pledged to end public financing for fossil fuel projects abroad, including, after some hesitation, of course, the Netherlands, who you may have seen our Prime Minister speak that we needed to have bold, resolute action now. And then initially he refused to sign this, but we did in the end. So the Netherlands is not going to finance fossil fuel projects abroad. And of course, it wouldn't be the Netherlands if we did not now have a conversation about what that means and whether dredging for oil pipelines is part of it. And so you see, it's typical the Netherlands. Then there was already the PPCA, the Powering Past Coal Alliance, that is now 48 countries committing to phase out coal power and various timelines, but all soon. So we are going in the right direction. It's not fast enough. It's not. There is lots of trouble. But I also I'm not desperate. We should not be desperate. There is good movements, and it will be very difficult for governments to stick to the status quo when the world is changing so rapidly. So there is opportunities to push further. But the question, and that's of course why you have invited me to speak, is whether banks get it. I still see this thing in the top. I don't know if you see that.
We don't see it.
Okay, good. Do banks get it? Do banks understand where the direction is going? And that's been the question that we have asked them for the last 18 years. And for the last 11 years, we have, together with our partners, Rainforest Action Network, that actually is leading this report, but also a few others. We have published the Banking on Climate Chaos report. It covers 60 largest banks in the world by asset, 2,300 companies in the coal, oil and gas sector over the period 2016-2020, so since the Paris Agreement, from the entire production cycle, upstream, downstream, transport, etc. This is a massive undertaking. I know you're a data scientist, so this report comes out in March, usually timed in such a way that we can use the findings for the annual meetings of most of the banks. But we already start working on it in August, so we are already in the middle of all this right now, because it comes in, it has a few sections. It has data on the actual financing, the portfolios of banks and financing of particular companies, and all kinds of subsectors. And it has analysis of the state of bank policies, whether they are excluding coal, oil and gas or subsectors of it and all that. So, and we make that assessment each year. And over the years, it has grown to quite an authoritative report that is referred to. It's quite an event when we publish it in March and gets picked up by The Guardian and the New York Times and all that. So we're quite pleased with that, but it's a lot of work. So this is figures from March. It's already a while back. We are working on the next edition, but the trend is sobering. As you can see, despite all the good words of Paris, since 2015, the trend is upwards. No, there is only more money coming from banks, commercial banks, to the oil and gas sector, with a little dip in 2020, which is of course related to the Corona situation. But if you look at the lower half, the first half of the year, then you see that it's a good guess, I think, that without the Corona situation, we would have seen an upward trend as well, because that was the trajectory in the beginning of the year, and only in the second half of the year was there a drop in investments and lending. But it's not exactly figures that makes you happy. Also of that, a big part is expansion. The orange part is the part of all these investments that is still 40% almost is still going into the expansion of the oil, gas and coal industry. It's unbelievable if you think of the figures that I presented before, that when there is zero space for expansion it makes no sense at all to further develop new oil reserves, that there is still 40% going to the expansion of the industry. I can't make it better than this, but that's where we are with the finance. And of course, we judge our work by whether we will at some point be able to see a downward trend in that overall things. Who's leading all this? The financing. This is the big 12, I think. Yeah, the 12. US banks, that's the short answer. US banks, Canadian banks, a few UK banks, and Japanese. That's the big 12. And JP Morgan Chase is by far the biggest financier of the fossil fuel industry, by a whopping 33% above, the next one, Citi. So if you look at the fossil fuel industry in total, it is US banks that are leading it. If you look at subsectors, for example, coal, then you see a different picture, and you see Chinese banks and Japanese banks popping up. I did not put slides in the presentation because it gets a bit, but you can all find it on that website that you saw. I'm sorry, the bankingonclimatechaos.org. You'll find all the data. So those are the biggest 12 banks. If we focus on Europe, it's Barclays, by far the biggest, French Paribas, HSBC, Credit Suisse, and Deutsche. I mean, if you look a bit back, it's they are, let's say, in the second tier of financiers of the fossil fuel industry. No Dutch banks, but I'll come to that. If we look a bit like at that specific part of the expansion, which we think, you can think of reasons why a bank cannot suddenly stop financing ongoing, exploration of oil and gas, or, cut ties immediately with their existing clients. But it's much more difficult to explain. Sorry. It's much more difficult to justify that you continue financing the expansion of the industry. And that list on the left is the biggest financiers of the expansion of the industry. As you can see, still no Dutch banks here, but more or less the same banks that are in general the biggest financiers are also the biggest financiers of the expansion of the industry. But we have a special focus, if not to say a special place in hell, for the banks that keep financing the fossil fuel expansion of it. And I had $1.5 trillion since Paris went to expanding the fossil fuel industry. For completeness sake, two pictures taken from our other website. I should have mentioned at fossilbanks.org, where we also, represent the same data. It's about ING and Rabobank. ABN AMRO Bank doesn't feature in our list of 60 banks, since it's not one of the 60 banks, largest banks in the world. It's no longer a global player as it used to be 15 years ago. But ING still 28. Out of the 60 largest banks, ING is the 28th largest bank of financier of the fossil fuel industry globally, with 44 billion a year. I mean, we can talk about a long time about what ING is doing in terms of changing its investments. it is changing its investments. It has stopped financing coal. It has made commitments to stop financing, well, to reduce its financing for the oil and gas sector, but it's nowhere near what we seek. But I'll come to that later too. Number 42 in the financing the expansion of the fossil fuel industry. So there is, you can conclude from that they do consider expansion a problematic thing, and that so while they have a certain chunk of money going to the fossil fuel industry in general, their role in the expansion is less. Rabobank, it's one of the 60 largest banks in the world, but it's not a big player on oil and gas, and it has also no desire to be one. So there is investments. I can't tell you what is behind that 8.2 billion. It can be all sorts of things. You can find all these data on our website on the Bank on Climate Chaos. You can, if you want to have the full Excel, you can download it and find out. But yeah, it's there. And ABN AMRO Bank, I don't have the figures at hand, but it's a smaller player, of course, and also not a bank that is determined to play a role in the oil and gas sector, although it does finance it. So where does that leave us? We have the problem is fossil fuels. There is movement, there is a change in thinking about what needs to happen, yet banks continue financing the fossil fuel industry, and that's precisely why we focus on that. Banks tend to, they are hesitant to act on their own. So we have also, there is all kinds of initiatives coming from the banking sector itself, in which they tend to operate jointly or to come up with joint standards or joint commitments. And two of them I mention here that we have been following for a long time. The Equator Principles exists already since 2003, in the same year as BankTrack was born. The Equator Principles were born. There is a whole story behind that, but it's not coincidence. But it took till 2017, yes, 15 years, before they could bring themselves to say, we support the objectives of the 2015 Paris Agreement. It doesn't get better than that. It's just this lame sentence that's in the preamble of the Equator Principles. But it means that 138 banks, all the global large banks in the world, have formally acknowledged under the Equator Principles to support the objective, which means that they, to bring down, to limit temperature change to 1.5 degrees. We published a report prior to Glasgow pointing out that it did not stop them from financing at least 200 fossil fuel projects since the Paris Agreement. So, and of course, the game is for us is to increase the pressure and increase the tension between such stated objectives and the actual financing by those banks. Another initiative that we saw in 2018, 2019 is the Principles for Responsible Banking. That's a UN-led, but industry-led, UN-supported initiative of banks that is now 360 banks, I think, if the latest count. And these 360 banks, they promised to align with 6 commitments, 6 principles. And principle 1 is what I copied here. We will align our business strategy to be consistent with and contribute to society's goals as expressed in the Paris Agreement. So we have it on paper. You promised that you are going to align your business with the goals of the Paris Agreement. So what we are doing with all these banks is point out that that can mean only one thing, that you stop financing the fossil fuel industry, since that's the root cause of the problem. But it's nowhere near like that. So we looked at, their reporting under these principles, and there is not a lot of good news to report. A lot of the banks have not even set concrete targets. There is only a handful of banks that make commitments on the fossil fuel front. And it's our role to hold them to account for what they have promised themselves. Yet there is a lot of change. And back to the data scientists here. What we also do under the Banking on Climate Chaos report and also on our website is keeping track of the changes that do happen in commitments of banks. And it would take a long evening to explain the trends and all this. But I copied 3 of our tables that give an idea. We are very critical, as you may have concluded by now. So if we just look at the total, the quality of the investment policies of banks when it comes to financing fossil fuels in general, we don't see any leaders, let alone, we don't see any front runners or leaders. We only see followers and laggards. So the banks that don't, the quality of their commitments to stop financing coal, oil and gas is not nearly enough. If we look at expansion, the problem that we just described, like we see a few banks that slowly take steps, and there is more. I mean, this is not a complete list of all the banks in the world. It's the banks that we cover. But we see some movement. We see, curbs on no further financing of expansion of, well, usually coal, but also gas, as Paribas does, and there's all kinds of commitments also in subsectors to not finance Arctic oil or to not finance deep sea oil or all kinds of regional things, tar sands, or there is movement. That's the key thing. I can't show you the movement on the screen, but on the slide, but there is change. And if you look, for example, on coal financing, then you see, yes, we see banks that get it. We see banks that stop financing coal altogether. And but then you also always have to look at the small print and the exceptions and the criteria and all that. So it's complicated to. There's almost no bank in the world that says we stop coal, period, and everybody that is operating a coal mine, there is the door out of here. It's always more complicated. Incidentally, we are right in the middle now of the next edition of the Banking on Climate Chaos Report. So we are sending out letters to, well, it's our friends at in France, Reclaim Finance, one of our partners, that is sending out letters to all the 60 banks again and asking for the latest updates on their policies. And I think that's testimony to the report. I see a lot of emails coming back from all the banks that we have written that are very keen to explain to us what has changed in their policies. And so there is, it will be reflected in the next edition of the report in March. There was all this movement with banks, but the key thing that came out, I mentioned the developments from like the 1.5 degree target, the trajectory towards it, that is and it all led to the big answer from the banking sector to the challenges is we want to be net zero by 2050. I mean, you have heard this for sure. Every bank, every company is now net zero by 2050. It sounds great. It sounds like we have read the report of the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change. We know that we need to be net zero by 2050. And we are. JP Morgan Chase, as we said, the largest financier of the fossil fuel sector, has a very enthusiastic press release in which they declare themselves net zero by 2050. And one initiative that came up in the run-up to Glasgow was the Net Zero Banking Alliance, where all the banks that want to declare themselves net zero by 2050 will team up. And there is 95 banks now that cover, according to the Net Zero Bank Alliance itself, 43% of all global banking assets have now declared themselves net zero by 2050. And on the right, it's the language that I took from the actual commitment that these banks sign. You see what that means? It means basically just saying that you will be net zero by 2050 without giving it any thought what that means, what you should do for it. It means that within 18 months of signing, note 18 months is a long time in the situation that we are in, set 2030 targets, because as you remember, it was important that there is not just 2050 targets, but also intermediate targets for 2030. So these banks have promised to do that, but in 18 months, we will be in, what is it, in 2023 by then, if That's very limited time, very little time left to reach that 2030 target. And then there's that other thing, banks should focus on priority sectors where banks can have most significant impact, which means that it doesn't have to be fossil fuels. If the bank is of the opinion that they can have a bigger impact on, let's say, aviation or shipping or cement, things that also need to change for sure, then they can do that. So there is no, you can be a net zero bank such as JP Morgan Chase without making any commitment to end your fossil fuel financing, let alone a commitment to stop the expansion, financing the expansion of the fossil fuel industry. And the other big problem we have with this initiative is that it has a very lavish timeline. There is an absence of urgency that is almost criminal given the situation we are in. So while it all sounds great, I mean, someone said to me like net zero is the new world peace. Who could be against net zero? But it all comes down to setting interim targets, not just 2030, but 2025. But also immediate right now, today, commitments to stop financing the expansion of the fossil fuel industry. And without it, it's a sad exercise, really. That heading in the top left, in the bottom left, is an article that we helped write, where in the run-up to the Glasgow summit, we found out that that HSBC had led a lobby effort to even water down this target setting. So that made us even more cynical about the situation. Something else needs to happen, and that is a real agenda for change. And I will not go into details of all this, but already for years, groups like us working with a lot of organizations globally have formulated what needs to happen. An end to, I mean, you can read it for yourself, but it's this is what we want to see happen with all the banks that finance the fossil fuel industry and want to deserve the name of being a climate responsible bank. Stop financing expansion, come up with a plan for all your other fossil fuel finance, require your climates to come up with a plan, like your fossil fuel climates, come up with targets for the rest of your portfolio, stop everything that involves human rights abuses, indigenous rights abuses, especially because a lot of the exploration is taking place on land of indigenous peoples. And tell the world, report on this, because there is a lot of claiming, but there's very little reporting on all these claims. This is what we have been pushing for. This is what is now supported by 234 organizations and counting. And that's also underneath the platform that we have built, the Fossil Banks No Thanks platform website, fossilbanks.org. On the right, you see all the organizations that are featured there. I just want to show you that there is a lot of organizations globally that work on this. And we feel good about this work. We feel that the combined pressure of all the organizations, some targeting specific banks, some working globally, some bringing in very specific expertise on oil and gas, and together we know a lot. And we are the global movement to stop bank finance for fossil fuels is growing and will be successful in the coming years. But that will not happen by itself. I mean, it will also not happen by sitting behind Zoom links. It will need active involvement of everybody, including, well, I mean, these are all pictures from protests that we organized with partners over the last few years at various bank AGMs and efforts. But you also see now that the Fridays for Future, the Extinction Rebellion groups in the world are also paying attention to the banking sector, because that's where things are winning. We're going to win this, it's going to be difficult, but there is a lot of energy with these movements. And in doing so, we will preserve our lovely cold winters, and we will see these stripes only in socks that you can buy on Facebook. They came in my timeline the other day when I was looking for these lights. So I thought they look good. Thank you very much for your attention. I hope this was of interest to you, and I'm happy to take questions.
Thank you so much, Johan, for this really wide-ranging, both harrowing and hopeful talk. And it yeah, shows again that the fight is not about data and reason. The fight is about money and power, as Bill McKinnon said recently. I'll give it up for questions. We already have a couple in the chat. If you want, you
I
can
didn't see
ask.
the chat. Let me check the chat.
Yeah,
Right.
I'll just ask the people to voice them if they want. Otherwise, I would just read them. So Bastian, do you want to read your question, or should I just ask it?
Yeah, I was just curious, how do banks justify their investments if it's so obvious, kind of, that in 10 years their investments should be completely phased out? What's their internal monologue on this, or something like that? How do they justify that?
Well, it's hard to give a general answer to it. I mean, this is what is changing. The assessment of what is a profitable investment is changing rapidly. Coal, if you spoke with banks 10 years ago, they all thought there is still a chance for investments in coal, but that's increasingly a no-go area, and that's what's reflected in these policy changes of banks. So banks have come to the conclusion that it makes no sense to finance a new coal power plant if it has to be I mean, this is the whole story about stranded assets. No, if you invest and you expect a certain return over the lifetime of the asset, a coal power plant would take like 30, 40 years, but there is no coal power plant in the world that will be around in 30, 40 years. With oil and gas, it's different. I mean, the usual response from banks on oil and gas is that the world will need oil and especially gas as a transition for a long time to come. This was the narrative until, well, it's still the narrative of a number of banks, but that's why that report from the International Energy Agency is so extremely important. This narrative is bollocks. It is not what the world needs, and this is the conclusion drawn by the most authoritative agency that we have on this. So this must have an effect on how banks assess investments. But we're not naive, no. We know that it's there is still a lot of money to be made from pushing on with, I mean, let's put it that way. These investments make no sense if the world is absolutely serious about doing what it takes to meet the 1.5-degree target. But we all know that this is not really happening. I mean, there's a lot of countries that pay just lip service to this goal, and therefore the markets still exist, and that's why there is still an appetite for oil and gas. But it's changing. It's also, yeah, I try to be optimistic in light of a lot of money still going the wrong way. But I hope that answers your question. But
can I maybe follow up on this, because it is interesting. You know, I mean, the cost of renewables has really fallen dramatically over the last 10 years, right? Solar 90% cheaper, wind 70% cheaper, and so on. And Carbon Tracker came out with a report recently saying, look, you know, investments in renewables basically outperform coal in all major markets. And you know, there's some modeling exercise saying, look, this is going to continue and so on. There's going to be abundant and cheap energy. But as you point out, as long as it's not really about costs, right? It's about profit. And so do you think we can expect, I mean, the market forces basically, in a sense, to sort of help us in the transition? Or is it really like we need to destroy the incumbents, in a sense, you know, nationalize the fossil fuel industry, have like super strong state intervention regulations to really say, look, the transition risk for all of these fossil fuels is so high, you can't do this anymore? Or do you think that actually, look, maybe renewables, if they get cheaper enough, they could outperform by virtue of market forces, the fossil fuel industry?
I'm not an energy expert, I should say this when I venture into this kind of discussions, but I think it will be a combination of both. I mean, it's clear renewables are, you know, the way to go, the cheaper option. Yet I think the market alone will never create the change we need in the time that is left. That is also the important thing. And we have squandered opportunities for I mean, every day that passes makes it more unlikely that we'll have a you know, a managed transition towards a renewable energy based economy. And I foresee that you know, as the impact of climate change is growing, and as the urgency becomes manifest, that governments will finally make drastic decisions to simply close down or prohibit coal. I mean, it's something that's almost overlooked, but it's also very well possible to simply prohibit the construction of coal power plants globally, you know, and that would save us a lot of time and a lot of discussions. And I think that's what we will see and soon if we want to have a chance. The thing is, yeah, the time of like we have this discussion with banks literally since 2003, you know, stop financing the fossil fuel industry. And we have now reached, I use this metaphor lately a lot, that we are standing here and here's where we have to go. And here is the abyss. And, you know, it's not good enough to take steps in the right direction. No? If you take steps in the right direction and you come to here, you will drop into the abyss. The only thing that's sensible at this point in time is to take all the steps necessary to get to the other side. And so that's why we are, you know, very impatient for banks to stop financing now.
Yeah.
I'm afraid it will all become very chaotic, to be honest, in the next 10 years. No? But,
yeah, I feel so too. Climate chaos, as you put it in the report. Tim, you had a question. Do you want to ask it, or should I read it out?
Sure. So my question was about the actual numbers on fossilbanks.org and whether they, I guess they're not normalized right now by total amount of assets that banks own. So I would assume that if there's a bank that has, let's say, 1 billion of investments to spend, and they spend 90% on that, of that on, for example, fossil fuel expansion, just hypothetically, then they would be, on some metric, they would be much worse than a bank that just by its sheer size has a small percentage investing in expansion that ends up being a much larger number than that other bank. So I was wondering if you have, if there are numbers about this and how important you think that sort of view is.
I'm not on the data side of this report. Let's put it that way. I mean, we have people working on this that understand the data set much better than me. But the point, the report is about absolute numbers. So it's I think I left something out. There was a slide. I use these slides more often. There's a slide about JP Morgan Chase that is in more detail about JP Morgan Chase being the largest financier of the fossil fuel industry, with that incredible number. What was it? 300 something billion. And then in that more detailed slide, it says, yet this is only 9% of the total assets of JP Morgan Chase, this total portfolio. So while it's an incredible number, it would not be the end of the world for the bank if they would step away from the fossil fuel sector. And for other banks, which are much deeper exposure to the fossil fuel sector, it could be 30–40%, but it could be a smaller number. It depends how you look at it. I mean, it's the absolute numbers are worse for the world. The percentages would make the bank more exposed and therefore a bigger villain, like a fossil fuel villain, you could argue. But what it also shows is that the deeper you're in it, the more difficult it is to switch direction as a bank. That's why also in our campaigning, we don't just focus on the banks that have a very large fossil fuel portfolio, but we also engage with banks that actually have very little or almost no exposure to the fossil fuel sector, because then we tell them it would help us, it would help the world if you nevertheless take a stance on the financing of fossil fuels. If you exclude it from your portfolio, you have nothing to lose or limited, you only have to make a limited change, but it will help us create the moral standard that a decent bank doesn't finance fossil fuels. So there is different arguments to bring to a bank that has a limited exposure than there is to a bank that has a large exposure.
Thanks.
Shall I just look at the data, the questions that I see here?
Yeah, let me. I mean, I manage this a little bit because I also want to use my my privileges as a host to intersperse questions. So on that, actually, because in the Banking of Climate Chaos report, you mentioned, okay, 3.8 trillion was funded in fossil fuel infrastructure by these banks. Do you have a sense of what proportion of these projects would have gone ahead without the money from the banks? I mean, I can imagine that, say, Exxon or Shell, they're not really dependent on money from banks, I would think. Like, do you have a sense of how important, how vital is that funding for actually the expansion?
No. That is a difficult question to answer. It is, I mean, large companies it depends on the, I mean, there is a lot of large oil majors that of course are well capitalized and could finance things on their own. Yet they do lend from banks because, you know, for all kinds of risk management reasons and for costs of capital and all that. So I can't answer directly your question like how much of this would proceed. We operate from the assumption that if we could cut down that very large flow of money going from commercial banks to the fossil fuel industry, that will have a big effect on the industry itself. And we see anecdotal evidence, for example, especially on coal. You know, like we you know, sometimes someone finds there is some CEO of a coal company or speaking at a conference or in some interview. And we always share this kind of quotes where they are complaining that it actually gets more and more difficult to obtain capital for their operations and all that. Another thing you would think, like Total Energies, the French company, is planning to finance a large. This is one of, we didn't speak about these things, but we spend a lot of time campaigning on specific projects. One of them, a large campaign we have against the planned East African crude oil pipeline, a massive, disastrous project that will see a pipeline transporting oil through numerous community grounds and nature reserves. It's on hold. It's been delayed, partly that we tend to think partly because of the work of us and a great many organizations, because it can't find the finance for the things. And this is Total Energy, so you would think, yeah, they could proceed, but it doesn't work that way. If the bank financing is not coming through, then the project is stuck. And
yeah, that's interesting. As it's quite a powerful midwife, if you want, for these projects. Yeah.
But it's a mixed picture. I mean, if you talk about coal expansion in China, I think it will. Well, there's a lot of Chinese state-owned banks financing coal in China. In China, it's now, I mean, China made the commitment to no longer finance coal abroad, but that will proceed one way or the other. No? That is, so there we have much less influence.
Okay, a couple of questions more from the chat. Lena?
Yes, I had some connection problems in the beginning of the call, so maybe you've mentioned that already. Basically, I was wondering, how did you get all the data? And you somehow mentioned that you were contacting the banks. How many banks just didn't answer, and are all major banks included in the rankings?
Okay. The data is, well, we built on the data year by year. So we talk about the expansion of the data set with a new year. So that is, it's Bloomberg terminal, access to the Bloomberg terminal, which is an expensive way of getting that. It's not us doing that. It's our friends at Rainforest Action Network. And we commission work with Profundo Research, an Amsterdam-based research company that we work with a lot for the last 20 years. And we send all this data for a check to all the banks that we cover. And to answer your question, well, we cover the 60 largest banks in the world. That's been the decision for the last edition. So yeah, well, yeah, it is the largest banks, but you may not know every single individual bank when it's in Korea or in China, but they are the biggest ones. We share the data set. We also share our initial analysis of their policies for feedback. I can't give you a percentage of how many banks respond, but the majority of it. And I just said that we are right in the middle of sharing our initial analysis of their policies. And the deadline was November 30, so yesterday, and my whole mailbox is full of responses from banks that do answer the questions that we have about their policies. That's how it works. It's a lot of work. And I'm not so involved in it. I just get a copy from all the emails, but it's other people that actually do the analysis of the very detailed analysis of the policies.
And maybe just a follow-up question: do you use any analytics tools to analyze all those reports and policies, or do you do it manually, basically?
We basically do it manually. We make the analysis, the thinking about the quality of this. We work now with Reclaim Finance in France. I don't know if you're familiar with them, but they have a web like a coal policy tracker, and they are going to launch the oil and gas policy tracker. After a lot of internal discussions, we thought that we should avoid having two such efforts happening at the same time. So we have merged these our work and their work. But it means that there is analysts looking at the policies that come out that are in the public domain, which is, of course, we can and we want only to judge the policies that are in the public domain, since we can't check what is, by definition, what's not in the public domain. But we also think it must be in the public domain. The commitments must be made public so that that it can be banks can be held accountable for. And I think that's also Eric, my colleague, has spoken to Fabian about this project that it would help if there was a way to be made aware of changes in these policies, because the way these things are being published is like, there could be a press release and there could be an update to the policies and we don't see everything. But if there was a way to automatically track changes on the websites of these banks, that would help a lot. It would mean that we will not overlook any such changes anymore.
Excellent.
Thank you.
Okay. Charlie, do you want to go ahead with your question?
We're just not that technical. We're campaigners, we do this work, but we're not data analysts. So we improvise, and sometimes you probably look at it like, God, this can be done so much easier. We welcome your help.
Yes, I was wondering that I could imagine that if a lot of people would change banks based on how they fund fossil fuels, that if there would be enough people doing that could motivate other banks to also change their policies as well. And I was wondering if you think that there could be such a tipping point, and if so, what would be needed to actually reach that point?
It is definitely important, and it's a good signal. I mean, what you have in mind to do is important, provided that the bank knows, and that's key, why people change bank accounts, because people change bank accounts for all kinds of reasons, and climate is usually not the biggest reason. So if you just change your bank account without explaining to the bank why you do it, it's that signal will not be picked up by the bank. But we do see ASN and Triodos, and this is the trend globally. They are growing. There is definitely a move from people putting their money at sustainable banks. It is one signal to banks. I think next to many, there is efforts of consumers, to mobilize consumers, bank customers to move their money. If it's done in a very public way, if it's connected to public actions, then this is definitely important, because it's all about the reputation of a bank. And if a bank senses that their well-managed reputation as a climate conscious bank is undermined by groups like us and picked up by customers, then they get nervous. That's what they don't want. But to be totally honest, I think there's also a word of caution in place, and that's the lesson learned from the fair trade coffee and all that, everything fair trade. There is when in the Netherlands, Max Havelaar was founded, 30 years ago or so, it was also thought this will revolutionize the coffee market. But after 30 years, the market share is, 2% or so. So I don't see it happen that a lot of people, like 40, 50, 60% of the people will change their bank account. Although there's many good reasons for it. And I always tell people that if you just do just one thing for the environment, don't bother about, you know, not getting into your car. Just change your bank. This is by far the most effective thing you can do. But yeah.
All right, thank you.
Yeah, that's interesting, Johan. I'd like to see some calculations. That's really the most important thing. One can do.
Maybe I exaggerate a bit, but it's absolutely important.
Yeah, no,
there is actually, Charlotte, what you ask. There is research about these things. I can't tell the details now, but you probably heard of the situation with the Dakota Access Pipeline in the United States that was financed by the construction of the pipeline was financed by about 20 banks. We spent a lot of time campaigning of it. You saw it on the first page. And there was research done in the US about people that changed their bank accounts because the banks were involved in the DAPL. And that was a substantial number. I have to look it up, but it's that was a moment when it was very obvious, because this was a very big thing in the United States and caused a lot of outrage. Whereas really substantial numbers of people switched to banks because they saw they were disgusted by the whole situation.
Yeah, it has a great documentary actually on the Standing Rock Dakota Access Pipeline struggle.
You know that we were sued. We were very much involved in this campaign, and we were sued by the Energy Transfer Partners, the company that runs the Dakota Access Pipeline, and they. At one day, literally, we got an envelope said that we were going to be sued for damage done to the company, and we had to pay. We were ordered to pay. We were brought for a federal court in the United States, and we were ordered to pay damage to the tune of $1 billion. And we had to fight it, so we had to hire a lawyer in the US, and it did cost us $30,000 in lawyer costs, but we won. I mean, the whole thing was dismissed as frivolous and all that.
Yeah, it was interesting. I mean, it's a strategy to put pressure on people fighting the good fight, of course.
Yeah, it was a slap suit, as we call it.
Yeah, Mirzad, you have a question.
Yes. Hi. Yeah, fascinating session. Thank you for the session. I was just wondering, just coming back to your last remark, Johan, as you're approaching a traditional market like finance and banking in order to make a difference and make a change. That's great. I was just wondering whether you have looked into new ventures like venture capitals. Just to provide you an example, the venture capitals, almost all of them have sustainability programs. The reason for that is that a lot of people who are concerned about climate change are going to the venture capital, starting a new startup, and coming up with ideas, which are, some of them are very revolutionary and actually could change a market. And just for the first half of the 2021, about $288 billion was invested by venture capitals to startups and new initiatives. So they think they will triple it this year, that amount. That's a big amount comparing to how much money this, for example, Dutch banks are investing into fossil industries. I'm just wondering whether you have tried to approach venture capitals to see if they need information, education, and training in their sustainability programs, because that's a huge thing and it's growing very fast, because it's directly related to people who are concerned about this problem.
Well, the short answer is no, and that is not because, I mean, we are aware of this. We don't follow it in detail. I mean, I can hear that you know this way better than me or than us, but it's very much a capacity issue. I mean, we have chosen as BankTrack to track banks, commercial banks. We work a lot with organizations that track development banks, the World Bank, the Asian Development Bank. We work with groups that work on pension funds. We work with groups that work on insurance companies, and
investors, share action investors, for instance.
Investors, all kinds, and we all have our strengths. And in order to not get too totally insane by the amount of work that's waiting us, we decided, like, we know there is a lot out there that also needs attention, or we led it to others, but there is a lot to do on the commercial bank front.
All right, fair enough. Thank you.
Okay, I'm going to skip the nuclear energy question because I think it's a distraction, and Johan is an energy expert. Ellie, do you want to go ahead?
Sure. Thank you very much for the discussion. I'm calling in from Germany. I just moved here from the United States, so I have a good opportunity to join a new bank. And I was just wondering if you have any insight you could share about the German banking context. And previously I had done some research around the Fair Finance Guide in Deutschland. And I just wondered if you knew anything about it and could give some guidance.
Well, we work a lot with the Fair Finance Guide, the various chapters in the world, including the Germans. In fact, I mean, it's now totally independent, but the Fair Finance Guides have they originate in the BankTrack network. It was like it was one of these ideas that came out of that when we were still a network, and now it has become a global organization, Fair Finance International. So we leave that kind of ranking and also like providing alternatives thanks to Fair Finance Guide a lot. I'm not an expert on German banks. We focus on Deutsche and Commerzbank mostly. The two banks that you also see in our ranking as large financiers of the fossil fuel industry, and thankfully there are also other banks. I mean, the German landscape, there's a lot of banks. There's also a lot of the Landesbanken and all that. These things also pop up, sometimes in the financing of dodgy deals when we deal with them. But I'm not the right person to ask which bank to choose, but Fair Finance is a good source. Yeah.
Okay, thank you very much.
We also work a lot with, you may have heard from Urgewald. You know this organization? They are the leading organization in Germany on bank campaigning, and we work very closely with them. So the website of Urgewald provides also a lot of information on German banks.
Perfect, thank you.
Andre, do you want to ask a question?
Yeah, sure. So thank you for the great talks so far. I wanted to, so you mentioned that switching banks is one of the best things you can do. The point I'm hearing more and more often now is also switching your pension. So I was wondering if you had something to say about that and maybe how to even do that in the Netherlands, because as far as I understand, it's just something that my company does for me, and I don't really have much to say on that.
Yeah, it's basically like that. If you have a company yourself, or like we faced this situation with BankTrack when we founded it, like we had to choose a pension arrangement, and then you have an option to choose. But once it's there, everyone in a company has to be in the same pension fund, and it's even how is it, obliged if you are a civil servant and all that. And there is nothing to choose. That also, you can also turn it around. You can say, I have nothing to choose. I'm forced to have my pension with this pension fund. Therefore, I want to have a say in where you invest. And that's been the argument that's been used by Fossielvrij in the Netherlands with their recent campaigning towards ABP, the pension fund for civil servants, and PGGM and others. So there is so there's two ways of looking at it. You can't change, but that also means that you would have an even more rightful right to demand from your pension fund that they no longer finance in fossil fuels. But as said, we don't work actively on pension funds, but we work with we know all these people, and we of course try to connect where possible. I mean, this is the divestment part of the story. What we look at as BankTrack is very much the lending towards companies, projects, new exploration projects, all that. The divestment campaign about asking institutional investors such as pension funds to divest their money has a different dynamics. No? It's about pushing your pension fund to engage with companies, but that story is a bit old by now, or divest from it. And we see a lot of victories nowadays, but it's a different sort of engagement.
Thank you.
Do you have a sense of how much the banks have in stocks, say, of fossil fuel companies? Like, is there data on this? Rather than just only loans and underwriting projects.
I don't have I can't give you a figure there. It's yeah. The other thing I was going to say about pension funds and about institutional investors in general is that they are also investing in banks that finance the fossil fuel industry. So it is also possible. It's a different angle, but you can these investors, not just large investors, but all kinds of investors, are allies or can be allies in our work, in our joint effort to pressure banks to change their policies. This is the work of Share Action in the UK and Fossielvrij in the Netherlands. It's there's all kinds of coalitions possible, and towards the AGMs of these banks, we team up with investors and banks to push them.
I have two last questions. I think we're out in terms of the chat. So just two short ones. One is that I saw you were part of this launch recently of the global oil and gas exit list, so this database of oil and gas companies. Do you think it would be interesting to organize a kind of a hackathon on this, where you're like, 20, 30 people looking at it, analyzing the data, maybe relating it to other data sources? Do you think that would it be interesting?
That would certainly be interesting. It's not, I just mentioned Urgewald, the German group, that is actually the lead group, that is, we team up with them, but they do all the work. All the credit for the global oil and gas exit list and the global coal exit list should go to Urgewald, that they have become, they have created this very, this database is now even endorsed by International Finance Corporation of the World Bank as the place to go if you want to understand who is actually, what constitutes the oil and gas sector, what constitutes the coal sector and all that. So it's not just about pure coal mines, but it's about, and they are data crunchers. They know, but I think they will be very interested. I'm be happy to make a bridge between you and Urgewald and see if that works.
Yeah, I think that could be fun for our community.
Yeah, sure. Let's do that as a follow-up. That's a very good idea.
Yeah. Nice. So then maybe lastly, Johan, you have been doing this at least with BankTrack. You said 18 years. You've looked at how banks have and continue to finance the destruction of the natural world in a sense. And I'm curious, and maybe this is too broad a question, but across your career, what were sort of like key moments or turning points or key actors, that you look back now and you sort of say, this is, what made a real difference. And where, going forward, do you see that these moments or turning points will reside?
That's I think if you look at, if I limit it, I saw your question, Merzat, about the meat industry. I'll come to that in a minute. But
I missed one. Okay, sorry.
Let me answer that one first, and then I'll come to your question.
Yeah, no, excellent. No, good idea.
We are aware that when I mentioned our plans for 2022, one thing that is absolutely on our in our planning is to have to focus more on the meat industry, because we for all the reasons, for climate reasons, for nature destruction, for the pandemic situation, we think that that's so this is the perfect target. If you go to our website, you do see that we have profiles of large meat industry, JBS, Marvig, in Brazil and all that, but we can do better than that, and that's also our plan for 2022. So yes, the meat industry is on our radar. Your question, well, it's a big question. I think if you look at what made change in the banking sector, I think, we can talk with banks, which is what we do. We talk about their policies and about their portfolio and about data and about, but what really makes the change is the Dapple case, this kind of situations, iconic fights that create a lot of problem, that it needs to be like a sort of perfect story. It sounds almost cynical, but the Dakota Access Pipeline was a perfect narrative. It was indigenous rights. It was very, a company that was not just an Energy Transfer Partners is not just, a pipeline company, but it's a very Texas-based redneck thing, So they made every possible mistake in how they present themselves, including to us, they they were really out there to literally kill people for their pipeline. So they were like the perfect adversary. And then there was the water, the aspect of water. Like everybody can relate to the need for water sources. There was, well, the centuries of oppression of indigenous groups in the United States, of Indian in the United States. Everything came together, and then there was the banks. And we focused, of course, on the financiers of the pipeline, and we exposed, together with our friends the world over, the role of these banks. And that's what got them into so much trouble. No? They were literally held responsible for, I mean, they were basically in the same line as Cortés, like it was that serious. They were, here was another chapter of oppression financed by banks, and that made them vulnerable. That also we managed to have a handful of banks actually withdraw their support, take the loss and sell the whole thing. But we also saw that afterwards, there is definitely less appetite for the financing of such pipelines. No, we see that now in Canada, and it's very difficult for such projects to obtain the finance. Also because on the indigenous side, it led to a lot of strengthening of self-confidence and renewed alliances and all that. So people are well organized. I would mention that kind of things as if you go back further in it's even longer than 18 years, but if you, because all that thinking about the impact of finance on environment and on people, before it started to focus on commercial banks, it focused on the role of the World Bank in the world, no? The large development bank. And then issues like the Narmada Dam in India is one of these very iconic fights that the Belo Dam in Brazil. There's all kinds of situations I can mention where everything comes together in a sort of perfect narrative, where movements manage to put enough pressure. And even if you don't win, I mean, the Dakota Access Pipeline was built, it's operating, although it's still not a finished story. It may still come to a halt. It has consequences for the risk appetite of banks and what banks are willing to finance in the future. This is one of the things that's always, we literally don't see what we have gained, what we have achieved, because these things were never built. So you can't point to the coal plant that wasn't there or the pipeline that isn't there, but there are many such things that didn't happen, and that it's hard to point to them.
Yeah, excellent. Well, this has been wonderful, Johan. Thank you so much, and also Eric for being with us and providing us with these insights and this extended discussion.
Well, thank you for the opportunity, and we have some good follow-up ideas, so let's do that.
Yes, we'd love to.